The first 48 years of my life, I lived in very violent circumstances. My father was a very violent man, and I hated him with a passion. The very ironic thing about it was, as much as I hated him, I grew up to be a very violent man. My dad started beating on me when I was just a little boy. And it broke my heart. And it seemed like I could never do anything to make him proud of me. And so things were pretty bad with my dad. There were times when I would pray to God at night to kill my dad. My mom finally kicked my dad out, and it was the happiest day of my life. And I think I was about 13. And I can remember laying in my bedroom that night, and I was so happy that finally he was going to be out of my life. But I heard my mom crying, and I felt so guilty that I just prayed that God would let him come back if it'd make my mom stop crying. And I will never forget that feeling of guilt. It went all through me. And I think that that's the moment that I stopped caring, that I started beginning to try to destroy myself. I just started hanging out with the wrong people, and I sought out the kids that were down on the corner by the school that were smoking cigarettes and skipping school, and that led to smoking weed and doing the harder drugs. And by the time that I was in high school, I was peddling marijuana, and really I was a junkie by the time I graduated high school. One of my goals in life was to become a drug dealer, and I did. And I went to college, and I flunked out of college because I was committing crimes. I didn't have time to go to school because I was too busy getting high. I was raised up in church. My mom took me to church every Sunday. I can even remember when my dad used to drive the church bus. But as soon as I could figure out how to get out of going to church, I did. I didn't feel what everyone else was feeling, or I didn't understand what everyone else was saying. I used to wonder why God was letting my dad beat on me. And that resentment to God turned into a hatred for God. And you know, that hatred for God turned into a way for me to blame God for all of my problems. My family, my mother especially, she was so afraid that I was going to wind up in prison that she would do anything that she could to keep that from happening. And I manipulated her in every way I could. I used her fear that I was going to die or go to prison to manipulate her and punish her in any way I could. And the drugs, I started using them to push that guilt and that shame and the remorse for what I knew was wrong. I used it to push that stuff down so I wouldn't have to feel. I was suicidal, but I was such a coward that I didn't really have the courage to kill myself. Every now and then, the family would get together and they'd do an intervention, and I think I wound up in 5 or 6 different rehabs over the years. I was arrested well over 100 times. I've got double-digit DUIs. I've got 9 felony drug convictions. I was about to go to prison for a long, long time. My family pulled some strings, spent their good, hard-earned money, called in some favors and helped me get into a place called Harbor House down in Fort Smith. I was just going to BS my way through it and get back to what I was doing, just like I always had. I've been in enough rehabs that I could pretty well learn the lingo and make you think that I was doing the thing. I was pretty good at that. But about 3 months in, my girlfriend called me, and someone had forced their way into her apartment and roughed her up, and some bad things happened. And she called me and she wanted me to come home. And I told her I'll be home. And I went to my counselor, and he said, yeah, you can go, but if you leave, you can't come back because you're court ordered in here, and we'll have to call your PO, and you won't be able to come back. And right then I knew that if I left, that'd mean a warrant, and I'd have to go on the run because I had a 20-year sentence hanging over my head, and that meant probably 5 or 6 years in the pen. I was tired. I was 48. I was tired of running, but I called her. I called my girlfriend, and I told her I wasn't coming home. And I felt like I was such a coward and such a no kind of a man at all. I remember just the anxiety that I felt, and I felt like I was going to jump out of my skin, and I was pacing back and forth, and I just felt like I was going to jump out of my skin. So I was trying to sleep that night, and I couldn't sleep. And so I got up out of the dorms, and I went into the classroom there at the Harbor House, and I found me a dark corner, and I got down on my knees, and I said this prayer. I said, God, you son of a bitch, if you're there, please fucking help me. And he did. He gave me just enough peace that I could go back in that dorm and lay down and pass out. And the next morning when I woke up, I stayed. And if I have to pick out a single moment in my life, that was the moment where my recovery began. That wasn't the moment that I came to God, but that's the moment when God came to me. For the longest time, I struggled and I struggled and I struggled to understand how God could ever love someone who had done as many things, as many messed up things to God's children as I'd done. How am I, after everything I've done, how am I ever going to do enough good to get even back to zero? To where I can maybe even, I'm going to have to live to be 100 to even get, if I do good the rest of my life, to even get back to even. And then they'd say, well, there was a guy that died on a cross about 2,000 years ago that wiped out everything that you ever did and that you're ever going to do. And I'm like, well, that doesn't mean me. You know, and my ego, my pride and my ego wouldn't allow me to think that God could forgive me. None of us are worthy. But that doesn't matter because it's already been bought and paid for. When Christ died on the cross for us, he made us worth dying for. because we weren't. And all he wants us to do is love each other. And my whole life I'm surrounded by love. The love of family, the love of friends. My goal is to try to love others as God's loved me. I'm still learning every day to trust in God. I'm getting better at it every day because he proves to me over and over and over again that if I just trust in him, everything is going to be okay. I owe everything to God. If God can restore a junkie like me, a criminal like me, a man who hated and cursed God, to a life as wonderful as I have, and love me unconditionally, what can't he do?